Our guest has been called one of the most important American writers in the 20th century. She has captivated readers with her honest writing about difficult subject matters, which explores themes of racism, grief, and fear. From her Newbery Medal winning novels like Number the Stars and The Giver, to her beloved Anastasia series, her contributions to literature are undeniably exceptional. It is with great honor that I welcome the literary luminary and icon of children's and young adult literature, none other than Lois Lowry.
I love the phrase, literary luminary. It matches my initials.
I must have manifested the LL initials when I wrote the questions. Lois, your journey as a writer is truly inspiring. Can you share with us influences from your childhood that ignited your passion for storytelling and led you on the path to becoming an acclaimed author?
I had a mother who read to me. I grew up in a house that valued books. And I think that was what affected me from my earliest days. The memory now of sitting on my mother's lap and she read Winnie the Pooh and stories about bunnies and piglets. And then as I grew older, stories about real people. And she never, what would the phrase be, talked down to me. She never simplified things. I remember, I've told this often, when I was 8 or 9 years old, my mother read aloud to my sister and me. My sister was 3 years older than I, a book that had been published for adults, and it was called The Yearling. And it changed my literate life. And it was about real people who suffered hardships, who went through tragedies. She read a chapter a night to us, and I have never forgotten those moments. And interestingly, the author, Catherine Patterson, I don't know if you've interviewed Catherine, but she says that book also, in her childhood, had the same effect on her. Let me add one thing. My mother also, from the time I was 5, took me to the public library. We lived in a small town, and by the time I was 6 or so, I could walk to the library by myself, even though it meant crossing 2 streets, but I was allowed to do that. And I've always remembered that library as my church. My mother took me to Sunday school at the Presbyterian Church every Sunday, but it was the library that was like a cathedral to me. And I always remembered it as having 100 marble steps. I moved away from that town when I was 11 years old. And I went back as an adult because I was asked to speak at that library. And I discovered that it only had 10 cement steps. But to me, as a little girl, walking up those steps was such a feeling of magnificence that I remembered it as huge and impressive. And it wasn't. It's just a little library, but it was so important to me.
By the year 2000s, 8 of your books has been challenged in schools and libraries in the United States. Your novels, particularly The Giver, has sparked both acclaim and controversy. How do you personally manage with this, and what are your thoughts on the significance of addressing difficult subject matters in literature for young audiences?
You must have done a lot of research, because I wouldn't have been able to tell you that 8 of my books have been challenged. I certainly know about a couple of them being challenged over the years and some being banned on occasion. But you must have dug very deep to find about 8 of them. As it happens, I mentioned to you earlier that I'm in Florida at the moment, but I subscribe to the New York Times, which I read every day. It comes every day here to Florida. But I also subscribe to a couple other newspapers. And just this morning, as it happens, I was reading a column in the Washington Post that is very interesting to me. It's a woman who gives advice. People write in with their problems, and she gives, and you know, a lot of newspapers have such things, and most of them are silly, but this particular woman gives very sound advice, and that's why I like reading it. And just this morning, I opened that up online, and someone had written in and said, my 16-year-old son has been dating a girl, his first girlfriend, for about 6 months. And they've been going steady for 6 months, but they're about to break up. She said, I can see it coming. And she said, this is going to be so heartbreaking for both of them. And I know the girl's parents. I'm thinking of calling the girl's mother so that we can talk about how to make this breakup easier for the kids. And she went on like that. The woman who gives such good advice said right off, do not do that, because heartbreak is how one learns to live in this world. And your son is going to grow up and become an adult, and he is going to have his heart broken again and again, and he is going to suffer tragedies, and he's going to lose a job and flunk a course, and he is going to learn how to deal with that as he goes along because he goes through it. Now, I mention this only because I think she's absolutely right, but also I think, though she didn't mention this, reading books, reading fiction is one of the ways we learn to deal with things that we're going to encounter in real life. And so when you read, well, when I read as a little girl, and every child has read a story about somebody whose dog dies, sob, 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 broke my heart. But then later, I had a dog who died. I've had several dogs who died. Everything prepares you for the next thing. It's like a rehearsal. And when you're sitting at home as a child, reading something that makes you sad or scared, you're doing it in the comfort of your own home with your mom in the next room or your teacher at the front of the room who can help you with it if you want to talk about it. And it's a very safe place to experience that kind of terrible set of events, because down the road, you're going to have to do it on your own. And it's a good way to start. I think that's what books are for. So I have no problem with writing about difficult subjects for kids because I think it's an important thing to do.
Throughout your successful career, especially in novels like Autumn Street and Number of the Stars, you fearlessly explored themes like loss, societal norms, and personal identity. How does your own life experiences and relationships shape the heartfelt emotions and authenticity in your storytelling?
It's interesting to me that you mentioned Autumn Street because that's one of my favorite of my books, but nobody even remembers it anymore. It was published in 1980, I believe, long time ago, still in print and still my favorite. And it comes from my own experience. But before that, my very first book, published in 1977, was called A Summer to Die. First book for kids. I had been a writer before that for adults. And that book came about because of my own experience. That book was published, A Summer to Die, when I was 40 years old. But when I was 25, I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think, that I had an older sister, 3 years older than I. When I was 25, my sister, 28, had died of cancer. That was the first tragedy of my life, really. And I grappled with that. And I had children of my own at the time who were very small. And my oldest was a little girl, sensitive little girl. And I tried to tell her about my sister and how we'd been pals growing up. And she would listen politely, but she wasn't really interested. And I started telling the story of my sister kind of to myself over the years. And then when I was 39 years old, a publisher asked me to write a book for young people. And that was the story that bubbled up and that I put on paper. And it was my first book, Summer to Die. And then Autumn Street, several years later, same thing, evolved out of an experience. You know, a minute ago, I said that was the first tragedy of my life. But actually, when I was a little girl, I had a friend in a small town in Pennsylvania where I lived who was murdered. And that's what Autumn Street deals with. So that's something else that had been simmering there for a long time. And I have sometimes mentioned, and I'll mention to you as well, that there is a line in a play by Shakespeare maybe you've had to read it in school, this one, Macbeth, it's from. In high schools always start out with Romeo and Juliet, but along the way you'll read Macbeth, and there is a line there when the character named Macduff is told that his wife and children have been murdered, and he becomes incoherent. And another character, I've forgotten which one, says to him 3 words, says, "Give sorrow words," and tells him to speak about his grief. And I think that's such important advice. And I'm guessing now my husband is sitting over here in this same room listening to us, but not appearing on screen. And he's retired, but he was a psychiatrist. And I bet if I asked him if that's good advice that Shakespeare gave, he would say, yes, give sorrow words. And that's what writers try to do.
Do you mind explaining what that phrase means?
Gee, that's a tough question because it means so many things. But that's your job to ask tough questions. It means to share it, to share your grief, to talk about it, to talk about what you've lost, not to repress things. I think that's what my psychiatrist sitting over here would say. That repression is what hurts people and damages people. And giving sorrow words is a way of freeing yourself from grief.
As a writer known for delivering the dystopian worlds in The Giver, Gathering Blue, Messenger, and Sun, collectively called the Giver Quartet, they tackle heavy subjects. Can you walk us through your creative process and how do you approach crafting complex narratives and characters that resonate with readers?
Walking you through my creative process is that would be a long walk, but an interesting one. I used to live in Boston, and there was a man who lived near us. His name is Robert Levin, who was a music expert. In fact, when he was a Harvard student, this is more than you need to know, but Mozart's final work was an unfinished mass, Requiem Mass. And Robert Levin, when he was a student at Harvard, finished Mozart's Mass. He wrote the conclusion to it. And he's a noted Mozart expert. I heard him giving a lecture once in which he described something that I'd never thought about, but it seemed so true. He said, when you sit down and a symphony orchestra begins to play a symphony, and you hear these wonderful chords of music, you also, at some point, very early on, you hear something that's a little off, that is unresolved. And the entire rest of the symphony is trying to resolve that piece of music that sets you slightly on edge. And that's what a book does too. And when I start my creative process, I sit down with a blank page or a blank computer screen, and a character has appeared in my head, and I start with the character. The character always appears kind of magically with a gender and an age. So The Giver begins with Jonas, age 12. Okay, he just appeared in my mind. But then, as the guy writing the symphony does, I make something seem a little bit off. And in The Giver, I did it in the first sentence. I don't have the book here in front of me, but I think it starts, it was almost December, and Jonas was beginning to be frightened. Okay, so the reader knows, okay, this is a book about a boy, his name is Jonas, but wait, why is he frightened? And the reader is going to turn the page to find out what's going on, what's not right here. And every book does the same thing. I do it in different ways, but it's always right at the beginning, something lets the reader know that something needs to be resolved, and it will be resolved by the end of the book. It may be an unhappy ending, but it will be an ending nonetheless. And from point A to point Z, then I make it up as I go along, and that is what the plot consists of. This happens, then because that happened, this happens, and then this other thing happens, and it seems not to fit, but oops, oh, here it does, it fits right in. And that's how I go along each day writing those pages until I get to the end where the thing that was off in the beginning is resolved.
Your contributions to literature have been nothing short of transformative. Looking back on your incredible body of work, what do you hope your literary legacy will be, and what message do you aspire to impart?
Well, first of all, I'll take exception with the word message because I don't like the thought of a book having a message. I can't imagine a kid saying, "Hey, come to the library with me. I heard there's a new book with a great message." That sounds too much like trying to read the Boy Scout manual or something. So forget message, but one hopes that books will have something of importance to say. Will invite the reader in. And young readers are, of course, embarking on the journey to adulthood. And that's often a very lonely journey. And books are great company and provide company when times are tough for young people. When we were in the midst of the pandemic, which is now several years back when all of that started, and schools closed and you had to go to school by Zoom, I couldn't visit all the classrooms that asked me to. So I had to say no, but I decided to say yes to classrooms in other countries. And during a couple of years there, I spoke to kids, high schools usually, high school classes, in Brazil, Korea, Japan, Nepal, Spain, Romania, zillions of classrooms in other countries. And that alerted me to something I'd never really thought about, that all of those kids, of course, they had to be able to speak English in order to do that Zoom. But all of those kids in those different cultures and different languages, they all cared about the same things. They all wanted to make the world a little better. And I guess in answer to your question, the thing I would hope to impart over my many years of writing books for young people is the awareness of how closely connected we all are to each other. Whatever our backgrounds, whatever our politics, whatever our religions, our colors, all of those things don't matter as much as the things that connect us. And I'm going to add one thing here. You mentioned the Giver Quartet, which is 4 books, and the final one is called Sun. In each of those books, the main character has some kind of almost magical quality. I didn't know there would be additional books, and when I wrote the first one, I simply called it Jonas Has the Capacity to See Beyond, whatever that means. But in the second book, it's a girl main character, and she has a particular gift in her hand. She's able to use embroidery and create a vision of the future. Third book, the boy, Maddie, the book is called Messenger, has the power of healing. But the fourth book is the most important one. And that, I think, is what I'd like to leave with the world. Because in the fourth book, the main character is Gabriel, who was the baby in the first one. And Gabriel discovers he doesn't know what to call it. And the word is never used in the book. But he has the capacity to enter another person's feelings and experience what they're experiencing. He discovers it first when he's watching 2 guys in a wrestling match, and he suddenly feels himself to be sweaty and wrestling, and he's startled by it. And then he develops that capacity more and more. And what he's experiencing is empathy, the ability to feel what somebody else feels. And that is the most important gift that a person can have, I think. It's if everybody were able to develop a gift of that sort, there would be no conflict in the world anymore. So that's what I hope to put out there.
Given your impact on children's literature, especially by your involvement with Like the Willow Tree, re-released by Scholastic during the 2020 pandemic, how do you perceive literature's role in fostering empathy, understanding, and societal change among young readers, particularly in today's rapidly evolving world?
It's interesting that you mentioned that particular book. Like the Willow Tree was published as part of a series that Scholastic did, and it was an interesting concept. Each book in that series, which is called the Dear America series, is centered around a historic event, but it's told through the eyes of a young person who's on the periphery of that event, observing whatever event is described in the book. And there had been a number of such books. A friend of mine had done 2 of them. And then Scholastic asked me if I'd like to do one, and I said yes, depending on what assignment they gave me. And they offered me the San Francisco earthquake, which would have been great fun to do, but I couldn't because I just couldn't go to California and spend the time there necessary for the research. However, they said, if you think of anything, let us know. And I thought of an idea because I lived in Maine near a village that is the last surviving Shaker village in the United States. Shakers was a religion that ended some years ago. They were celibate. They didn't marry, and so they didn't reproduce. And they acquired new members by taking in orphans. It's a very interesting religion. And you can go to the Shaker village in Maine and have a tour and have it all explained to you. And it's really quite fascinating. So I asked if I could do a book about the Shakers. And then, of course, I had to find a child to tell the story. And I had to find a way for her to be orphaned. And ta-da, the flu epidemic of 1918 orphaned an enormous number of children in the United States. And that's why, during the pandemic, Scholastic decided to reissue that book. And in fact, they put a new cover on it. And the girl on the new cover has a mask over her face, as indeed they did in 1918. So it was a way to introduce children to what they were going through in these times, which had happened before. Although I used my child and the death of her parents to create her being taken to live with the Shaker community in Maine. It invites the reader to feel what the book's protagonist is feeling and create that kind of empathy.
As we conclude our interview, it is evident that Lois's writing has consistently emphasized the importance of human connections, portraying them as the vital threads that weave through the fabric of her narratives, anchoring her characters and resonating deeply with the readers. Let us carry forward the lessons learned from Lois's stories, and in doing so, we honor her thoughtful insight into the enduring power of storytelling and the boundless capacity of the human spirit. Thank you, Lois Lowry, for sharing your remarkable talent and wisdom with us.
Oh, thank you, Christopher. It's been fun to be with you.